Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Kinzie, and I'm joining you today from the Strive Group in Anchorage, Alaska. Welcome to our webinars. Today's topic is on communication cues, and I'm specifically going to be addressing communication cues in a virtual environment. Tomorrow's session will be with Jonathan King on psychological safety, and then Wednesday I'll be back with information on the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program for non-traditional claimants, such as sole proprietors, gig workers, etc. If you're new to our webinars, know that we do them daily, and you can visit our website at thestrivegroup.com for programming. Just hit our COVID-19 resource link, and it'll show all of the upcoming ones, and it'll also have a link to all of our previously recorded sessions. So I encourage you to visit that website to see if there's anything that might be of value to you. If you're with us live today, I'd ask that you could engage with me through the chat function. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat. You're not going to necessarily see the chats from others that are asking it. It all depends on whether or not that question is published or not. But you can always send a chat to our moderator. Marshall is my moderator today, and Marshall will interrupt me and let me know when there's a question. So I think that I'm going to address that question throughout the rest of the webinar. I may ignore it. I apologize in advance. Or if I am not going to address it with the regular content, I will either interrupt and address it at the time, or I'll save it to the end. So hopefully if you have a chat during the live function, I can get to you. If it comes across a little bit late, rounding into the 11 o'clock hour, just leave your email address and I will contact you directly with the answer. All right? So we'll just go ahead and get started, and I'm going to make a bunch of assumptions here as we dive into the content. And the first big assumption is that you and I can agree that communication is a key element, or it is essential to effective professional work, effective outcomes or goal-oriented work, or just in general, it's key to our success, whether we are thinking about it from a professional standpoint or thinking about it from a personal standpoint. Let's just agree that it is a key element of that. If you don't think that that's the case, then perhaps this webinar is not for you. I definitely think that's the case. Hence, I put together the content that you'll see here today. So the content for this webinar is literally drilling into communication cues. We've got verbal cues, paraverbal cues, and nonverbal cues. So if you've never heard some of those words before, don't fret, because voila, I've got a slide for each. Let's specifically talk about verbal cues. Verbal cues are our words. It's the choice of words that are coming out of our mouth, whether they're in a formal stance or a informal stance, whether they are jargon or our own little, private language for our profession or for our friends. Cussing as an example of a verbal cue. And then also the structure and arrangement of how we put our words. So whether it's in written form or orally, like I'm doing with you here today, I am choosing a certain structure of my message. There is hopefully, there is a start, there's a middle or a climax and an end. They're not just random thoughts, right? So that's the structure of our verbal cues. And then we've got paraverbal communication. That's how we sound. So these are things like my tone of my voice. Like, for instance, my son always knows when my mood has changed or when I want him to pay attention. It's not necessarily that my volume is changing, although that's a paraverbal cue as well, but it's that my tone changes. So I've gone from jovial or conversational to more directive, right? So that's a tone issue. Or emphasis, what word am I emphasizing to get someone to pay attention? The speed in which I talk. Today's webinar, I was telling Marshall earlier when we were doing a sound check, I'm going to fly through this stuff. There is so much stuff to cover, and I love this topic. So I will probably have a tendency to speed up when I get super, super excited, because I want you to be as excited as I am, right? But that's a paraverbal cue that I use, sometimes intentionally, sometimes intentionally, and it gets people to either pay attention or tune out to my message. And then accents. I don't think I have an accent, but the moment I go back to my roots, so I was born and raised in the South, people think I have a incredible accent. And I'm like, what you talking about? I don't have an accent. And they're like, oh, yes, you do. And of course, the reverse is true. I think that they have an incredible accent. So their accents, the way they sound and what their accents do to syllables or do to the sounds of the words, that has an effect on our overall message, right? We can capitalize on that, or we can, ignore it and fall victim to it. Our choice. We'll talk about that later. And then, of course, the volume. And I already kind of referred to it when I was talking, giving you the story of my son. But I have a tendency to be a pretty loud talker anyway. But if I am raising my voice, everybody in the office knows it, right? Most people can hear me talk because my voice carries, but that is different than me raising my voice to call attention to something in the message, right? But those are all the paraverbal cues. Nonverbal cues are the way we look when we are communicating. And it is a myth that a nonverbal cue is whether or not we're attractive or not. Now, certainly beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? But certainly your attractiveness to the receiver of the information, it plays a part in their interest in you, but that is different than you using what you look like as a nonverbal cue, right? That's not necessarily if you find me attractive or incredibly not. It's what I choose to do with what I have that is the nonverbal cue. So things like my body language. Am I sitting up straight? Am I trying to maintain eye contact? Am I hunched over sort of in a defensive or a disengaged posture, or am I leaning in, right? So body language, the proximity. I currently have myself, a certain distance away from my camera, because my camera is only like my little web camera, right? It's not like this super fancy camera, but even that, if I were in person, trust me, I would be too close, right? So your proximity to your receiver of information is a nonverbal cue. If you're going to be perceived as being standoffish because you're putting a lot of distance between the two of you, or if you are going to be perceived as being aggressive or assertive because you're a tad bit too close. If you're standing versus sitting, that could lend itself to a proximity perception. Facial expressions goes without saying. I don't know what I look like oftentimes because I don't sit in front of a mirror, but I have heard that I have a pretty unpleasant resting face, and I don't know what I should do about that, but nonetheless, that tells me that perhaps my face is not inviting, or perhaps my facial expression is not personable or approachable unless I am talking. I try very hard when I'm talking with people or when I'm presenting information to not look non-approachable, but I've been told that when I'm not, I sometimes, get a little lazy about that. So that's something that's a cue that I can either capitalize on, or if I ignore, I could fall victim to. So eye contact and movement becomes very, very important. And so whether you're making eye contact with somebody or you're at least attempting to make eye contact with somebody, like I am here today with my camera, because my camera is your eyes, or at least I can assume that they are, or whether or not I'm rolling my eyes or I'm averting my eyes, right? So the eye movement becomes a cue that I can use for my favor or otherwise. Dress and personal appearance goes without saying. That is a nonverbal cue that I can either use to my advantage, or if I can choose to ignore it, then I might fall victim to it. And then finally, gesturing. And this is, as you can tell, even here on a picture-to-picture format, my gesturing is pretty demonstrative. I am a hand talker. It's called gesticulation, and I do it a lot. It is not just a habit, but it's something that I have learned to do to add to my nonverbal cues. And those habits are very hard to break. And so for someone, whether I'm in person or in a virtual environment, if they're distracted by that, I, as the sender of information, have to be very aware and cognizant of those distractions so I can do something to mitigate it, such as sit on my hands or try to keep my hands, folded in front of me and intentionally not use them. So anyway, those are nonverbal cues. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a summary here. We have verbal cues, which are the words and the structure and the jargon and such that we choose to use. Paraverbal cues is how we sound, and then of course nonverbal cues is how we look. When we are in-person communication, whether it's with someone down the hall that we have the opportunity to meet with, or we can poke our head into somebody's cubicle space or their office space, we have the potential for very rich communication, which is why I've given this picture on the right-hand side. It's colorful, unlike the pictures in the previous slides that I had really muted, because if we only are capitalizing on our verbal, so we're relying on our words only, or we're relying on the context of how we sound. Do we sound happy? Do we sound angry? Blah, blah, blah. Or if we're not capitalizing on our nonverbal communication cues as much as we can, then we just simply don't have such of a colorful picture of our communication, whether it's with somebody, across town on video conference or whatever, or whether it's someone across the world. We have not fully capitalized on what we say and what they hear and how our message is portrayed through all of those cues. And so as you can imagine, if we capitalize on all of them in person, then our message is clearly understood. And that's just like a beautiful thing. We'll be like, woohoo, we can party because what we said was what they received, which is a fantastic thing, regardless of language barriers and cultural barriers and, all of these other things. What we said was what we heard, because we chose to capitalize on this concept of utilizing all of our cues. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, right? We choose, or in cases like today, in remote environments or virtual environments, our choices are stripped from us, right? So we're not always victims like what we may be today. Sometimes we choose to strip away paraverbal and strip away nonverbal communication cues, and we're only left, or we're only giving ourselves a verbal cue. So let's think about types of environments, types of communication environments, or otherwise you could think of them like engagements, right? Types of engagements where we only have verbal cues. And so I'll give you a second or two before I advance and give you the cheat, right? So this is like a mini quiz. What environments might you only have verbal cues in? Or think of it this way, verbal cues available to you in, right? So I'll give you a little bit of a second. This is not a hard test. You should fly right through it, but you should have come up with things like letters, emails, an instant message or texting, right? Any reports that you're giving, to somebody to read, or documents that you're giving to someone to read without context of you explaining or presenting those documents. Those are mediums, if you will, right? How you're getting your message across is a medium that have no paraverbal communication cue context to them and no nonverbal communication cue context to them. Now, I'm going to put a caveat in that. We've gotten to be pretty clever over the years, right? So emojis or bitmojis or little symbols, thumbs up, thumbs down, those types of things. We've started to interject them into our verbal communication when we only have verbal communication. We've started to inject these little things. Like originally we had italics and bold and underline. That was some genius way before me. That was his or her way of injecting paraverbal emphasis into the verbal cue, right? The written word only. And so we have ways to accommodate our verbal communication cues, but then the question would be is, are we using them wisely, right? But we'll get to that in a minute, so don't jump ahead. So second quiz. When might you only have verbal or paraverbal communication cues? So you're either choosing to not have nonverbal communication supplementing your message, or you are unable to have nonverbal communication supplementing your message. A really good example was one that I just had this morning, and a client that I'm working with does not have a webcam or any way to otherwise have picture-to-picture communication. And so for no fault of either of us, right, we were stuck with only a phone call, which is a verbal and a paraverbal cue available to us only situation, right? So it wasn't that we were choosing to cripple ourselves, but because of the circumstances, we were indeed crippled, right? So I'd like you to just think about it just for a second. What engagements are you, finding yourselves in, whether professionally or personally, it doesn't matter, that you only have verbal cues or paraverbal cues available to you, right? So again, these aren't difficult questions, and I've already kind of given you a cheat on one, but we have phone calls, right? Or audio conferences, sorry, not video conferences, but audio conferences. We have audio recordings, we have voicemail messages, right? So anytime we have verbal cues and paraverbal cues available to us, we're richening our message, or we're strengthening our engagement because of all of those cues, but we're still just not quite there, right? So once we add the picture-to-picture or the virtual environment, right? The picture-to-picture environment, we're closer than audio only, right? We're definitely closer than just email only or report or letter only, but we're not necessarily at full, full capacity, right? So I've put a gradient into this image to try to express to you that we're not quite there fully, right? But these are the environments that the majority of us have been thrown into with this COVID-19 issue. Unless you were like someone like me, I got thrown into it when we started the Strive group, because we knew that the future was going to be in virtual or remote environments, right? And so we invested in really good audio and video equipment, right? And so all of our meetings are done this way, and our trainings are done this way, and so on and so forth. But for most of us, we are just now being thrown into this. So imagine your teachers and your kids as students, and your colleagues and your clients, right? A lot of them, they've used FaceTime on their phone. They've never ever thought to do it professionally, right? And so this is a very new environment to them, and it gets us closer, but it doesn't necessarily get us that rich, really, really full, no transparency at all, rich engagement. It does get us closer, however. I just used however twice. It gets us closer, but if we don't capitalize on it, if we don't accommodate where we are missing some cues, or if we don't realize how detrimental those cues are if we're using them incorrectly in a virtual environment, then we're really never going to get to the full, rich, I get it conversation, right? We're always going to be at that 70% transparency like I have here on the slide if we don't learn to create better new habits. And that's really why you came here today. And so I'm going to dive into that. But I thank you for letting me give you the history and the foundation before we dive into using our communication cues wisely in a virtual environment. So let's go back to verbal communication cues only. Choice of words, structure, and formality. When you are in a virtual environment, you have to follow the keep it simple analogy. So KIS, keep it simple, otherwise known as KISS, right? So not the band. That was funny. I cracked myself up. Anyway, so choice of words, structure, and formality. So when you are in a virtual environment, sometimes you have to pre-think things. So before you enable your camera and enable your audio, think about what you're saying, because if you're using words that are acronyms or jargon, or otherwise, my mom used to call them SAT words, so they're super fancy words, out of context or with poor audio video engagement or connectivity, you might miss something. So you throw out a 5-syllable word with a poor audio connection, and you pretty much have 2 syllables of gobbledygook because it was missed, right? So keep it simple for your choice of words. And then for your sentence structure, you have to be mindful. Again, before you enable your camera or enable your audio, make sure you know what you're going to say, so you're not just rambling on air, right? And somebody else is trying to figure out how to mute you or interrupt because you're randomly thinking all over the place. Your message wasn't structured and concise, right? So that's super important. And knowing that half of us on this planet are random thinkers and random communicators, that means that we have a pretty strong probability that a video conference with a staff meeting or an information sharing or problem solving video conference is going to be pretty painful, because those people that are random thinkers and random talkers, stream of consciousness communicators is what I usually call them, they are not being efficient while they are live, right? So you have to really think about that. And that means that you have to adapt. I'm not saying that anything's wrong with that type of thinking, right? Has a tendency to be way more creative than my type of thinking. But for a virtual world, we're going to have to rein it in and put some organization and structure around it. And then the formality of the situation. I have a tendency to be pretty informal in person. Anybody that's ever worked with me, I don't know if they like it or they don't, but they've all commented on it. I have a tendency to be pretty informal. But the moment I join a virtual world, I have to up my game a little bit, right? I have to sit up straight. Sorry, that's a nonverbal cue, so I'm going to try to leave that out for now. But I have to figuratively formalize and make my words sit up straight, right? So not a lot of joking going along, not a lot of sort of assumptions being made in my word choices, not a lot of informality in my word choices, right? So I have to think about that to not be distracting in a virtual world. All right, so now let's talk about paraverbal communications in a virtual world. So in a non-virtual world, we've got, of course, emphasis, tone, speed, accent, volume. They're all here in a virtual world, but we have to think about them differently. So for instance, our emphasis in real world is generally never missed, right? Because we've got someone right there in person. And so when we are emphasizing a word or we are enunciating a word, and all the other words are not enunciated, most people will figure out what we're meaning by that. But in a virtual world, it comes across like it's almost lost in translation. So even right now, if I were to slow down my tone and enunciate a word, right, you're going to think, what's wrong with her? Like, is the video or the audio wrong? Or is she patronizing me? Is she like trying to be condescending? Is she, treating me like I'm an idiot, right? That is lost when we're not in person. So in a virtual world, we have to really be careful of what words we're choosing to emphasize. And maybe we choose to emphasize them in a different way, such as, using speed to emphasize it, or a pregnant pause afterwards to emphasize the word, right? Maybe we choose to emphasize it in a different way virtually. Our tone, we have to be very careful of tone because we are missing the richness of the nuances of that audio message when we were otherwise in person. And so because we're coming over a phone line or a voice over internet, right, we have a tendency to lose all of the nuances of our voice because, our audio is only so good. And so we have to be very, very cognizant of how we are coming across, because we're missing all of that context, and we're probably also missing the nonverbal cues that we would otherwise get, or the context of the relationship that we would otherwise get once we've entered a virtual world or a remote world only. So speed is really important to adjust when you're in a virtual world, because if you go too fast and you've got poor audio or poor video connections, more than likely people are going to miss what you're saying. But if you slow it down too much, more than likely people are going to tune out, right? Because you've become something that's difficult to listen to because you are so slow. And so we have to find that sweet spot in between. And then accents become even tougher in a virtual world, because, like, so for instance, when I speak with somebody or at church, prior to shelter in place orders, I go to church and we have a priest in our church that has a very, very strong accent. And I have to work to eliminate all distractions, to pay really close attention to, like, for instance, his homily, so I don't miss anything, right? But I have to work really, really hard at that. Well, you can imagine in a virtual world how that also is really difficult, because we may see pictures of our colleagues that are also on the call. We may have bad audio or bad video connection, and things are freezing or maybe slowing down or pixelating or something. And so it becomes really, really difficult to just focus in on what is being said. And so for those of us who do have accents, we have to accommodate and either slow things down or say things twice, or otherwise allow for some Q&A, right? That's an accommodation in order to make sure that our message is well understood, if we know that we have an accent that part of our engagers, the people we're engaging with, that they are going to likely struggle with, right? Or they've either told us, or we can make some safe assumptions. And then, of course, volume. Volume is really weird in a virtual world, because you never know if someone's screaming at you or if their mic is turned up way too hot, right? So they've got a really, really hot mic, or if they're disengaged, or it's just that their mic is turned super, super low. And so volume is super tricky in a video or an audio or a virtual world. And so I would suggest, before you start a meeting, is do a quick round robin sound check to make sure that everybody is at kind of a level playing field for volume, because that way you're not making the wrong assumption later on when Heather's trying to talk, or Marshall's trying to talk, or Dave chimes in with an idea and the volumes are all wonky, right? So just something for you to think about. Now we've got nonverbal cues, and just so you know, I've got a lot of slides on nonverbal cues, because it becomes such an important cue, right? It is so incredibly important. And so we've got this body language. And so, like, today I've situated my camera. You can kind of see kind of like from my upper chest up, right? So that's all you can see. Students, as an example, that come to my classes in person, they get the whole thing, right? So I'm 5'8", I'm usually 5'11" with heels. I walk around, I gesticulate. They're getting like the whole package. But students of our virtual classes are only getting this, right? So I, as the presenter of information, or as the communicator, I have to be aware that this is all they're getting. And for someone like me, it becomes actually a little bit more manic, because my legs aren't moving, right? And so we have to be really, really aware of not how we see ourselves, but how others are seeing us in a virtual environment. And it's our job to mitigate that, so we're not distracting to them, or that we're using such a powerful cue like body language, we're using it in our favor, as opposed to having it cripple us or damage the message. Same thing for proximity. I have intentionally put myself fairly back today, but when I had a meeting with Marshall earlier, because he's just a staff person and it was a little bit more intimate setting, I moved my chair up a bit, right? And it's just a little bit. I mean, you can't see my pores, thank goodness, right? But it's a little bit more intimate when I'm having a one-on-one conversation with Marshall, versus when I push my chair back a little bit and I'm changing the proximity, and it feels as if there's more of you there, right? And For you, it feels as if I'm at a table as opposed to in your face, right? So we can utilize our camera and how close we are to that in a different way in a virtual world. And we should be doing that given the intimacy or the formality of the situation. And then we have facial expressions, and this is very, very similar, right? You're only getting this. You're only getting this. So I may clap, right? And so I suppose if I clap right here, like yay, or whatever, right? You get that. In an in-person world, you'd see me clap regardless of where my hands were, right? And that supplements this, right? But in a virtual world, we probably only have this. And so our facial expressions, whether we are jovial or concerned or empathetic or compassionate, or whether we're sad or whatever. I can't do it all. I failed drama, clearly, but I can't put all of those facial expressions on my face. But we've got to realize that when we only have someone's face to see, that's what we've got to use, right? And in a virtual environment, we have to teach ourselves to use our facial expressions a little bit more supplementing our message as opposed to perhaps contradicting our message, right? So then we have eye movement. I'm telling you, I do webinars every day, and I'm the host on some and I'm the talent on others, like I am today. But I do webinars every single day, right? 5 a week with a variety of experts that join us. And some of them, they look right at the camera and I feel like they are talking to me and they're talking to our audience, right? And when I'm with them in person, they're like that too, right? They're looking for my eyes so they can make eye contact. And even when I'm disengaged, they come up and they're like, "You with me, Heather? What do you think about this?" Right? They're trying to make eye contact with me, and they're doing a great job virtually. But some of them, they're not. Right? They're looking down at their notes, or they're looking over here, or the light's in their face and they don't like it. And so they're trying to cheat and kind of do up here or whatever. But I'm telling you, cameras don't lie. A camera is your eye, right? My receiver's eye. And if you are in a virtual environment, you have to realize that eye is on you at all times. And so if you are not making eye movement and eye contact with the camera, I promise you, you are not engaging your colleagues or your clients or whoever it is that's joining you virtually, okay? And then, of course, gesturing. And I've already said that I gesticulate a lot, right? And I did a webinar on Friday where I was the talent as well, and I was doing this a lot. And of course, it comes out of context. It becomes like, how big was that fish that you caught, right? I'm holding it right here by the camera, so it looks freaking huge, right? And my hands look like huge man hands. And I thought of the Seinfeld, the Seinfeld episode where Seinfeld was dating the women with the man hands. I was silly. But anyway, that's what I thought of. And so I'm like, I can't watch myself because my hands look so big. So today I wanted to make sure I gesticulated around the same proximity as my face so my hands don't look so big. But gesticulation can become a really, really important cue for you, but only if you use it wisely. If you know darn well you're distracting, then you're going to need to sit on it, literally. Sit on your hands or put them on your lap or hold something that you subconsciously won't spill, like my coffee, right? My coffee is right here. And if I was really worried about it, I would hold the coffee in my hand because subconsciously I wouldn't move that hand because it would spill, right? So those are the types of things that you have to think about in a virtual world for nonverbal cues. And then the last one that I'll talk about is dress and personal appearance and environment. And I actually added this slide. Well, I added to this slide, I guess I should say, this morning after our all staff meeting. But dress and personal appearance is super duper important in today's COVID world for obvious reasons, right? We are working. It may not be important when you're FaceTiming your mom or you've got your kids and your parents online, so you're doing sort of a chat, or if you're doing happy hour, right? Maybe what you're wearing doesn't matter, but at work it does. It just does, and there's nothing you can do about it. And even me, I've been wearing jeans ever since we've been in shelter in place, and I'm kind of one of the very, very, very few in this big office of ours. I've been wearing jeans, but it makes a difference, right? I don't feel as professional because I'm not dressing as professional. And And our clients, my clients, they're noticing. And so if my clients are noticing what I'm wearing, I can promise you your colleagues are noticing what you're wearing, right? Because how can you not, right? So you really do have to realize that while working, professionalism needs to be portrayed and demonstrated with the way we look and with the way we're dressed. And that goes to our environment's experience, our environment's appearance as well. So like I don't use a fake background. So what you see behind me is my office. And it's not always clean, but it's clean for webinars and it's clean for my meetings with clients. And that's because if I had the client in my office, I would straighten up my office. That's just the way I am. And that's the way I demonstrate professionalism. And so I would ask that you as the employee or boss or manager or project manager that's now, literally thrown into a virtual environment, that you think about that. And yeah, your bed may be made, so good for you. I don't make my bed every day, so good for you. I'm quite jelly. Still not the appropriate background for a work meeting, right? Or while you have like this cool background software that, makes you look like you're on a beach, keep in mind that that's giving some, I don't know the actual word, but I call it like video static or technological interference. So when you have that virtual background on, your camera is trying to make sense of what it sees. And when you are moving unnaturally, right, because that's just a fake background behind you, your camera's trying to make sense of that. And so it'll pixelate differently kind of around your head. And it's distracting, and it doesn't scream, I am a professional taking this message seriously. And if you're working with a client or a customer or a business-to-business partner, and you're inadvertently screaming, I'm not taking this seriously, then what type of message does that leave them about you or about your company? And so I would encourage you to think about how strong those nonverbal cues are about the way you look, the way you're dressed, and your hair and whatever the case may be, as well as the environment around you. All right, so I'm going to end with this, and I am going to go to questions because I know there has been some, and I know we're running super late, so thank you for keeping with me here today. But many of us don't capitalize on our communication cues in person, and that's just unfortunate. But hopefully this webinar today will kind of clue in, oh my goodness, I probably need to in person. We certainly need to capitalize on them in a virtual environment, because if we don't start to be mindful and thoughtful about utilizing these cues wisely, we're probably going to be crippling our message. And so what I want for all of us is to have this rich, in-person-esque environment virtually, right? Fully colorful, fully I get it, even though we're virtually meeting with each other, right? That's what we're shooting for. And so again, I apologize for running late. Let me just see if we're getting any questions. Oh my gosh, we have so many questions. Is it rude to ask someone to please stop talking so fast? No, it is not rude. It is not rude. It is not rude. It is not rude. Is this COVID-19 stay-at-home environment, how can verbal and nonverbal cues be enhanced? I already answered that. Question, how do I make sure I'm connecting with people on the other side of the camera? Is it best to look at the images or directly in the camera? I already answered that one. Look directly in the camera. Some people have to wait their turn because of the way the audio conferences are. You can only talk one at a time. I would suggest using nonverbal cues like raising your hand, or if your software platform has a virtual hand raising or a chat function, hey, I have something to add, right? I would suggest accommodating in another way so you're not inadvertently railroading somebody else who has the figurative microphone. Okay, so my moderator said, Heather, you're going way too long. People are dropping off. So thank you for not dropping off if you're still with me. I urge you to visit our website for additional programming and to see the previously recorded sessions. Here's my information. I urge you to contact me directly should you have any questions. Here's what the Strive group can offer you. For you, yourself personally or your business. Now I feel like I'm just rambling because I know I went way late. So thank you very much for joining us. I really do appreciate your time today, and I look forward to the next time we have an opportunity to talk about these subjects because I love them. So, all right, here's me and all my nonverbal, paraverbal, and verbal cues signing